So we have mentioned about the role itself. So how about the content itself? Is there any good element of a good piece of technical content?
Make sure it's correct. I tell various sarcastic jokes. As a technical writer, you won't hear anything about your documentation unless it's wrong. Believe me, then you'll hear. You'll never hear if your documentation is correct. But if it's wrong, you'll hear about it, and you'll hear about it from a number of sources, which is both great because it means, okay, someone read it and they're like, yeah, it's wrong. So try and make sure it's correct. And it goes back to what I was saying about you have to learn everything to a good enough level to be able to document it for the customer. You are only human. You will make mistakes. People reviewing your documentation will make mistakes. Ultimately, it's your documentation. It's on you. You'll make mistakes in the same way software has bugs. It's just the way of the world. So try and make sure it's correct, except it won't always be correct. Documentation rots really quickly as well. So especially documentation that is not online, because if you are still, some companies are putting out PDFs as their documentation. As soon as you release that documentation, that PDF leaves, it's out of date. And I know that sounds awfully brutal and a little bit dramatic, but effectively it is. It's out of date. You can't update that PDF. It's now sitting in their inbox. You're done. And you're especially done if it's wrong. So I would say if you are still creating PDF content, try and move to some sort of online content because it gives you much more control to update it. Good documentation also make use of layering. So information density, I think, is a really important point here. And it goes back to if the customer is reading your documentation, they are probably annoyed. So you need to give them the right documentation at the right time and no more. I mean, you may know lots more about the product and you may be very tempted to say, also, there's this really cool feature. If you do blah, 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 they don't care. Just give them what they want to know when they want to know it. What you can do, though, is you can take advantage of layering. So you can layer your content. So you can use things like links and signposting to say, if you want to find out more about this super cool feature that I really like, click here. And that allows your reader to explore at their pace on their timescale. So that's a really useful technique. Another one, I think it's the difference between what's really obvious and what's valuable. And it's very easy, and I know I've fallen into this trap in the past. It's very easy to document the obvious. And sometimes you do that because you want the documentation to be complete. And even if one feature is really, 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 really obvious, you as a technical writer think, but it's on the page, so I should put it in the documentation because there's a thing about completeness going on. But equally, if it's really obvious, you don't need to document it. And I think it took me quite a lot of experience before I kind of realized I don't need to document that. It's okay. Valuable versus obvious. The one that comes to mind, and I think will be most relatable, is frequently asked questions. This drives me mental. Good frequently asked questions are very, very rare. So if you are asked to create frequently asked questions, make sure they're the right ones. Because there is nothing more infuriating for a user when they're going through a process and says, have you checked our frequently asked questions? And they have a question and it's not there. So really think long and hard about creating frequently asked questions. Go to your support department and say, what questions do you get asked? Because they'll say, we get asked X, Y, and Z quite often, but we never get asked this one. Okay, take that one out and put X, Y, and Z in. Give your users a fighting chance, because if your frequently asked questions are not frequently asked questions, you're going to really annoy your customer base. So make sure they're correct. Make sure they are valuable and you're documenting the right things. Use your company's brand voice. That's one that most tech writers usually just have to fall in line with. It doesn't need to be dry. Not all companies have dry branding, but be very careful if you're going to deviate too far from that, especially as, something like slang definitely doesn't translate well. So always consider translation costs, especially if you're a global company. Even if you're not a global company, consider translation costs. Consider how readable your content is as well. Remember the language that you're writing in. Everybody reading your content, that might not be their first language. So don't go and create documentation that is littered with words that are not in common usage. It's just not cool. Make sure it's up to date. Use signposting. Make sure it's not muddled and confused. I've seen some documentation that's just muddled and confused. I was going to say use headings. That's very print-based, but you can do that with online-based as well. structure, get a pen and paper, work out how you're going to structure the documentation, especially if you're in the privileged position of creating the documentation from scratch, which often you are, because technical writers are not the first role that most startups think of. So they go, oh, at some point we need a technical writer. And then this technical writer comes in expecting to work on documentation and gets told, yeah, there isn't any documentation. You're creating it from the ground up. And that can be a pretty fun as well as slightly stressful journey.